session on increasing equity using evidence-based assessments. And our presenters today are Karen Singer-Freeman, who is Director of Academic Planning and Assessment, Harriet Hobbs, who is Director of Assessment Systems and University Accreditation, and Christine Robinson, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Assessment and Accreditation, all at the University of North Carolina. As we move into this session, I want to remind everybody that the way that we're going to interact here will be to have open discussion throughout the session. So if you have questions, please unmute and ask questions at any time, but please try to remute again after you've asked your question to save our sound system here. And also, if you'd rather not speak, you can always write your questions in the chat bar. We'll be monitoring the chat. We will probably pause periodically to answer questions that appear in chat. And there will be times when the speakers will answer questions throughout the presentation and stop for that. But if you have an urgent question, then please unmute and ask that question then. Lastly, we are going to be recording. So if you do not want to have your face appear in the recording, or you don't want your name in the recording, then please take your video off and change your name to something anonymous. Otherwise, those will be recorded and the chat will be saved. So I believe Karen has control of the recording. So if she's ready to go, she'll begin recording. And welcome.
All right, so it's me. I am up, and welcome to everyone. I usually take a shower every day, but today I actually had to dress up half of me anyway and put on makeup, so I looked good for today. And sometimes it gets you in a different mood than when you just get up every day and have to go to work. So welcome. I am excited to have all of you here. Why don't we get started? I'm going to give the first slide is just an overview of what we're doing today. So we're going to address the 3 learning outcomes, what we hope you gain from our presentation today in the workshop. We will also share some examples of some aggregated data and the information we think that hides behind that we need to really delve into. We'll introduce you to our theoretical model that was published in the assessment update, assessment update, I think last fall. And it introduces you to the model of really looking at assignment types and how those can impact equity in relationship to student performance. Today we'll add an additional aspect to that, which will be an indirect measure of surveying students. We will collaboratively, as much as we can, examine assignment types. So we have some activities for you in which you will be able to discern and look at disaggregated data and ask questions. And then lastly, we would like to brainstorm with you about how we might use this approach with faculty to adopt this method. So here's some outcomes for the workshop that we hope will be helpful to you, is identifying some questions and practices about inclusive assessment and student learning that can be addressed using existing sources on your campus. Identifying some strengths and weaknesses of assignment types, and also understanding the importance of disaggregating data by student characteristic. And if any of you sat through the keynote by Dr. Kina Arbuthnot, you'll understand why we were so excited to hear her keynote and how it relates to what we're doing today. So what we want to do is, for each of our folks on the call, I'll ask you, and I'll try to, and I do have roll here, so I'll call you out by name, is to briefly introduce yourself and tell us what brings you to this work. And I will start off by giving an example. So I'm Christine Robinson. I'm from UNC Charlotte. And what brought me to this work is in, I believe it was 2018, Harriet and I actually sat through a keynote address by Tia McNair, and we also sat through a keynote last year that she did at the IUPUI Assessment Conference. She is a vice president at AACNU. Additionally, we have been reading Eric Montenegro and Natasha Jankowski's work, and each of these three persons address the importance of examining assessment and its impact on student success. And as a person of color, I have experienced the system and I understand why this needs to be addressed and why we must persist with this. So I have the roll in front of me, and I'll just call you out by name because it's easier. Sometimes we don't know, should I go, should I go, should I go? So I'll just start from the beginning. So Tanisha, if you are on the call with us, if you could just give us a 20-second introduction of who you are and why you are, what brings you to this work.
Tanisha emailed me minutes before saying she got called into work and she is not going to be with us and very sorry.
Okay, so the next person I have is Stacy.
Hello, I'm Stacy Benton. I am faculty. I am an assistant professor of veterinary technology at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash College. And I am the vet tech representative on the college academic assessment committee. And I am slated to be the vice chair of that committee this coming academic year. So just trying to twofold. One, become much better versed in the language and theory of academic assessment. And in terms of equity as a profession, veterinary medicine is trying to increase diversity among the veterinary profession. And in particular, we would like our veterinary technology program to represent the communities that we serve better. And it starts with having successful students make it through the program. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important. Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Ashandia. I work at the University of Illinois at Chicago as the assessment coordinator for our intergroup dialogue program. And that's why I'm here. That intergroup dialogue is about equity in terms of social identity and power dynamics, and we have classes that encourage students to talk about those issues in a way that bridges differences. So it's important to me that the assessment itself for that program be equity-minded.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. If you, I apologize if y'all hear me typing, but I'm trying to keep notes on you so I can come back and remember who you are so I can talk to you in the future. How about Stephanie? Okay. Kimberly? How about Jana?
I'm here. Good morning, everyone. I'm the Director of Assessment at South Dakota State University. And I'm here because our campus went through quite a bit of assessment work. And we also have a requirement that all of our undergraduate programs have a diversity, inclusion, and equity student learning outcome. And so I get a lot of questions from my academic program and faculty colleagues about, what is the best way to sort of assess those types of learning outcomes and build them into curriculum and the courses. And so I'm here to get some more knowledge for myself and then bring it back to my campus. So thank you.
Fantastic. That is an awesome student learning outcome. And we have it for our freshmen, and we are still trying to understand how to assess it as well. So thank you for that. Charlene.
Hi, so my name is Charlene Lewis Sutherland, she, her, hers. What brings me to this work is I'm passionate about social justice. After I started a social justice community of practice actually on our campus, I'm at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I had the good fortune of taking a few estimate assessments. assessment and equity workshops at ACPA over the last few years, where got to really kind of just kind of dip my toes into the world of equity and assessment. And so I'm here to learn more and keep practicing.
Great, thank you. How about Anne?
Great. Good morning. Sorry, I can turn on my video here. Good morning. I am the project manager for academic assessment at UC Davis. And what brings me to this work are sort of two, I come at this work from two directions. One is the sort of social justice work has been a part of my career for long before I arrived to assessment, so it didn't make sense to leave it at the door when I arrived to this work, first. And then secondly, through my career as faculty, watching how assessment can contribute to equitable or inequitable outcomes has ensured that I want to, in our work, help other faculty that we work with and other programs that we work with move towards more equitable practices.
Thank you. Thank you. David? How about Lori?
Hi, I'm Lori Walmsley. I'm a faculty librarian at Mount Hood Community College in Oregon. And what brings me to this work is I've just always been interested in assessment. As a teacher, I think it's important to also be a learner in the classroom, not just the authority of knowledge. And I say that with sarcasm. And so to me, I just want to figure out some language around how I can talk to other faculty who see assessment as just a part of an accreditation act, and instead reframe their thinking to, no, it is about equity, it is about improving student learning. So just trying to build my toolkit in talking with other faculty about assessment.
Great, thank you. Janice?
Sorry, my phone was ringing at the same time that you were calling on me. I'm Janice Williamson. I teach at Bowie State University, which is in Maryland. It's an HBCU, and a few years ago, I worked on a grant, culturally responsive teaching with some public school teachers. And I've been doing assessment in my department for a while, but I'm interested in learning how to do culturally responsive assessment when our expectations are the same for every student in the class, like in terms of what we want them to be able to do and what they know. So, how do you assess that they can do these same things even though their learning styles and their cultural backgrounds are very different? So that's my big question that I hope this conference will help me figure out.
Fantastic. Holt?
Hi, I'm library faculty at Brigham Young University. I'm in charge of the library's assessment office that looks at examining the library services, resources, spaces, and personnel. And I have to admit, in fair disclosure, this was one of two workshops that I wanted to go to, and I could only afford to go to one, and the other one I wanted to was canceled, so I've gladly been able to shovel into this one. But of late, there's always been ongoing discussion on our campus about how to make minorities and others welcome and invited into our campus, and particularly into our library. And recently there was a report from Duke University Libraries that discussed the role of Black students at Duke University, and it's kind of accelerated this conversation that's been ongoing. And so it's one of the things that we're looking at, and I'm looking to try and just better understand how to include others that may feel marginalized, and how to frame questions and our assessments in such a way that invite people to participate and feel included in what we're doing.
Great, thank you. Melina, and I'm gonna apologize if I mispronounce your name. Please correct me.
It's Milena. Thank you.
Melina.
So I'm from LaGuardia Community College in the city in New York, which is part, our college is part of the City University of New York. And I'm interested in assessment and equity from different points of view. At LaGuardia, we are intense with assessment at the classroom level, at the institutional level, for core competencies, for mode of teaching, for model learning, for many different ways. So we're thinking about assessment all the time. And as you know, so you kind of like start thinking about it, and then how you can go from your classroom to the institutional level of measure of student success, and how your instruction actually impacts that, and how that increases at the department level, and how that increases to the institutional level, and how that is counting towards the whole system level. And also that is kind of like a personal practice kind of like point of view, also from my personal experience living in New York City. I didn't grow up in US, and I saw the differences straight away, and I was starting to think like, why is so different? Why my students in LaGuardia are so different from the students in Columbia? Why are, in the Columbia University, right? So I started to think about that. I have a son who is in the system, in the educational system. So, it's like I'm thinking about it all the time. And finally, as part of my involvement with the math reform in developmental mathematics at LaGuardia, we just realized that the different ways of assessing and creating opportunities for students to express themselves can make a big impact on that without even looking at disaggregations yet. So I'm really interested looking at disaggregations, and then I have worked with Carnegie Foundation and the Dana Center to assess that and to learn about that. So it's just everywhere. So this is a great experience for me to be here in this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne?
I think I already went.
Oh, you did?
Unless
Okay.
there's two Anns.
Okay. Right. Let's see. Reem, did I get you?
Yes, that's correct. Hi, everyone. My name is Reem. I'm a colleague of Milena as well. I'm also faculty in the math department, and I also wasn't educated in this country. And so when I started working at LaGuardia, we're a Hispanic serving institution, I did anecdotally observe gap in achievement among my students. And so I worked on contextualizing the curriculum, and while contextualizing some of the math curriculum, I looked at the math for social justice, and I create modules that talks about that. And then later, when I shifted into evaluating my teaching practices and also assessing some of the program that I direct, like the supplemental instruction, we always said that, we're helping students from diverse backgrounds with a Hispanic serving institution, but we really never examined equity under the lens. And so hearing the keynote of Dr. Arbuthnot and hearing the conversation of New York City and the segregation of the school system in New York City, that's really what brought me into the conversation. And I'd like to be more mindful of my assessment at the classroom level, but also how we could, as faculty, build a consensus about making it institutional-wise, because our faculty are very passionate about social justice, but we also want to bring it up from assessment in the classroom into having these equity-minded assessment practices at the college level.
Yes, yes. Damon?
And actually it's Kent. And
Kent. Okay.
Yeah, it's half of the AALHE has me as Damon, half of it has as Kent.
Okay.
My paper presentation was Damon, but my site was Kent. So it's a little crazy, but I do go by Kent. And I've been working in this area for quite a while, about this kind of researcher in my institutional roles. when I was at Penn State years ago, I was involved in the Excel Coalition, which was an engineering coalition focused on equity. I also authored the AACNU National Study of General Education back in 2000. And in that, we kind of identified, if you will, this idea of inclusive excellence. That was kind of a theme that popped out when we looked at everybody. So back, 10, 20 years ago, that's kind of when I began to work in it. I think for us personally right now, I mean, the challenge we have at our institution is we are a metropolitan university. And when you look at our population of students compared to, say, the metropolitan region, we're underrepresented, if you will, in two populations specifically, quite a bit, African American and Hispanic. And so we're developing pipelines as part of kind of our strategic plan to increase that. But as we develop those pipelines into the Fort Wayne area school districts, I want to make sure that we bring students in and set them up for success. So I think this idea of integrating what we're doing from a teaching learning side, well assessed, really in the pipeline up until and through their matriculation to college is real important. So I thought this session would really help us kind of understand some of that.
Great, thank you. Kara or Kara?
It's Kara.
Thank
you. No, you got it. I'm Kara Maloney, and the garbage truck is going by outside, if you can hear that. She, her, hers. And I am a colleague of Ann's. I'm the UC Davis Academic Assessment Team Lead. And I believe assessment is equity work. And it underpins all of the work we do at UC Davis. My goal today, because I'll just write. I wrote it out so I wouldn't mumble and do what I'm doing right now. My goal for today is to increase and deepen my capacity. I have background in teaching and culturally responsive pedagogy, but I'm always looking to deepen and expand our work. In our work, we coach faculty rather than we don't tell them what to do, because that's not a very productive approach. But we really have been and continue to work with faculty to encourage them to think of assessment as a tool for creating inclusive, student-centered, and culturally responsive opportunities to learn for all students. So I'm excited to be able to spend this morning with all of you in getting better, at least, or at least knowing more, I hope, and then we'll move to application. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Timmy? Did I say that right?
Taimi. So
Taimi, dang it.
It is historically an Estonian name. So friend of my mother's. It's hard for many people to say. So Taimi Olson. I'm director of a Teaching and Learning Center, Office of Teaching Effectiveness and Innovation at Clemson University. I'm a colleague of Claudia's and very active in the POD organization. I've been here 3 years. We are working on general education revisioning. So with Associate Dean Bridget Trogdon, we've both been at Clemson for 3 years. And I have always done my schooling and most of my schooling and my work in the South. So I'm from North Carolina originally, spent 20 years in Tennessee teaching, and then went to University of Tennessee with their Center for Teaching and Learning. So I feel like I'm here. My goal is to really update, because I feel like this work has really kept my attention throughout my career in teaching literature and moving into faculty development, right? So American literature and all of the aspects of American literature, we've had decades, a half a century at least, on talking about inclusivity issues in the curriculum. But now, besides working on general education, I'm involved in the transparency in learning and teaching, which the transparency project really tries to emphasize bringing all students in through transparent teaching methods, right, aimed at assessment. And so Bridget and I have worked on assignment design. In my unit here, we're working on universal design for learning. And of course, in this current time, being at Clemson is difficult because it is a campus, for those that don't know, that both has some incredible people, Rhonda Thomas, who leads Call My Name. She's a researcher with a wonderful Facebook looking at the history of enslaved peoples and convict laborers at Clemson. Clemson has built on a former slave plantation. So we have that plantation house in the middle of campus. It's quite a shock if you know what to look for. And of course, we're in South Carolina, which does not allow things like changing the names of historic buildings. So we have all sorts of problems, but also like great people like Rhonda. This is also the University Lee Gill, if you've heard of him, who runs Call My Name, Call Me Mister, excuse me, which is a really great program for prospective college students. Okay, so I just want to do more work. Yeah, I think that's enough.
Okay. Thank you. Young A?
Hello, it's Yonga. It's perfect, almost perfect. Thank you. My name is Yonga. I'm an analytics and assessment specialist at UC Davis. I work with Kara and Anne. What brings me here is UC Davis being a very diverse school, university. We have a mission in our academic assessment team for advocating for inclusive, equitable, and sustainable assessment practices. So I'm here to learn everything I can from this workshop and from the whole conference. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you. And I think we have a few more. And Jill Carlson.
Yep, that's me. I'm the Director for Assessment and Accreditation at Santa Fe Community College in beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico, the oldest capital in the United States. We are an Hispanic serving institution. We really sit at a nexus of three major cultures. And so multiculturalism and culturally relevant social justice and assessment are all very important to us. I'm also proud to say we're a sanctuary campus. When I'm not doing assessment, I'm an historian, I teach history. And so lots of issues, right, that have repeated year after year in history and provide very robust discussions in my classroom.
Thank you. And Jill Kern.
Hi, so I'm the other Jill in this session, and I'm the Director of Assessment and Accreditation at Eastern Washington University. And my academic career was focused on issues of intergroup relations around particularly like race and gender and other forms of difference and power relations. And I moved from that into assessment, and I've been doing assessment for, I don't know, 5 years or so. And the twain have not met. So I have not been bringing my background in diversity and inclusion into my work in assessment, and I want to learn how. I want to bring those two, my core passion, my two core passions together. And so that's why I'm here today.
Great, thank you. And I think we have one more person. David, did I get you?
No, I had trouble with my mic.
Oh, okay.
I'm not the most technological person. This has been an experience trying to do this. It's been rewarding, but the virtual, and I teach online all the time, so I don't know why I had to. So I'm also at Santa Fe Community College, the Hispanic Serving Institution, and I work closely with Jill. I'm the history faculty. I was co-chair of the assessment committee, and now I'm chair of the Gen Ed committee. Before I was at Santa Fe Community College, I worked at Dene College, which is the Navajo Tribal College. And before that, I was in Mississippi. I was at the branch of Mississippi State University, which was a majority Black institution. And I adjuncted at Miles College, which is an HBCU. And when I was doing my PhD at Florida State, I also took courses at FAMU, which is another HBCU. And I was born in Newark. My family's kind of convoluted. So I've always grown up with in a multicultural environment. My dissertation is looking at Native American European interactions in the South. I think I've been drawn to the topic for research, and at Santa Fe, my committee in particular, the Gen Ed committee, is really focusing on equity, and so I think we're all trying to educate ourselves as best as possible in how to apply this in a useful and, well, let me put it differently, a meaningful way.
Great. Thank you, David. I hope I have everyone. If I've missed you, who did I miss? Yes.
One of the co-hosts.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I wanted to chime in.
Oh, yes, you and Karen, yes.
So hi, everyone. My name is Harriet Hobbs, and I am one of the co-presenters for today's workshop. But I thought it would behoove me to share what brings me to this work as well. I am passionate about social justice, in particular, as an African-American mom who have 2 brown boys, a host of brown nephews who will be going to college. So for me, I really want to, and a PhD student, really unpack systemic and institutional racism in terms of the structure and policies that are in place that actually perpetuate into the classroom, and then help unraveling that fabric that's so deeply embedded into these institutions. I think when we begin to partner with faculty members as allyship to dismantle what we can do within that particular space is what I'm definitely passionate about. From a broader perspective, I am really looking to write my dissertation through the lens of race. I'm looking at critical race theory, as well as I'm torn between that and this notion of non-cognitive factors and how they impact the academic achievement of African-American males at predominantly white institutions.
Thank you. And Karen.
So, you know, my reasons for my interest in the work, I think, echo practically something everybody said. So the first is I've had a lifelong concern for social justice. When I was 5, I saw footage of the Vietnam War, and I was so angry that I got dubbed that I had a sense of outrage by my parents. And that has persisted throughout my life, that when I see inequities, it really makes me angry. The second is I was a faculty member for 20 years at one of the State University of New York schools, where about half of our students would be considered underserved by one classification or another. And I became increasingly involved in classroom-based work and also supplemental program work like summer research programs to try and reduce equity gaps. And so for me, it's part and parcel of my view of good teaching is that to be a good teacher, somebody said we have to be learning from our students. And one thing we have to learn is where are we failing? And I believe deeply that equity gaps represent failures in the classroom or in the assessment office. My own research is very numbers based, or my previous research, and I took a componential approach to cognitive development. So my own dissertation was on analogical reasoning in 2-year-olds, and I broke down analogical reasoning into the component cognitive steps and analyzed where 2-year-olds could succeed and fail. And as I began as a faculty member to think about why there were gaps in my classroom, I naturally began to think in that kind of compartmentalized way to see what is it about my teaching and about my testing and my assessing that's evoking these gaps. And so you're going to see that flavor to the work that we're going to be presenting today. And I love numbers. So whenever I look at numbers, I think about what they mean. And when it comes down to it, assessments often are numbers. And so when we disaggregate, we learn so much more about what's going on behind the numbers.
Christine, we have one more, Julie Morrison. She needs to introduce herself.
Yes, I was just about to get to Julie. Julie.
Thank you. I appreciate being able to jump in here. I am a faculty member
at Glendale Community College in Arizona. We are Hispanic serving and veteran friendly. I have been in the role of leading our assessment team for 3 years, and we are now creating a new method to really assess our institutional learning outcome data. And with that, we have data dashboards that can now better look at these types of equity issues. And so as we're moving into this new space and folks will be coming to me and saying, well, what are we going to do with this data? I want an answer. So I'm here.
Great, thank you. Great. All right. If I've missed anybody, just poke me, or Harriet. She's monitoring the chat, and so you'll understand why this is important when we move on, because it's very useful to know where people are coming from and what they're interested in getting out of this. And we also hope some collaborations between participants or with participants and us come out of this as well and into the future. So let me quickly go to the next slide, which is what questions could we ask ourselves, because I know there are a number of folks in assessment professionals on the call about assessment and equity. Do different assignments measure different abilities? Do assignment formats influence students' demonstration of learning? And do student learning outcome reports, and I'll give an example of this, actually capture important differences in student success? So in order for us to analyze some of this data, I will tell you the instruments or resources and tools that we use. We have a learning management system where we were able to collect information about in relationship to syllabi, course grades, etc. We use Canvas. We also have an assessment management system where that is our repository for our student learning outcome reports, and we use Compliance Assist for that. And then our student information system, we use Banner. That's where we gathered our student demographics and characteristics. All right, so I promised you an example of a student learning outcome report and where we think data might be hiding from us, given that we typically report in aggregated terms. So this is an example of typically student learning outcome reports. When they are reported, we have an outcome, we have a measure. In this case, the example we're going to provide is going to be a rubric, but sometimes that rubric has multiple dimensions. In this case, our example, it has a 5-point rating and multiple dimensions. But when it is reported, it is typically reported on average, how did students score? And we all usually have, at least we require, a criterion. So a criterion could be 70% or more students scored 3 or better on the rubric. Now, the question is, what if we disaggregated that information just on the rubric score? Would that tell a different story? And, uh-oh, there we go. So we have, I'm sorry, I was waiting for the reveal. So here's our example from a information technology course. So you'll see the outcome. You'll see that students are measured on their ability to do a website. They have 4 to 6 attempts to demonstrate that. The criteria, you see that there are 4 of them in which they are measured on. The target is that 80% or more will receive a 3 or better, or 3 or higher on the rubric. And the result is, drum roll, 97% did. And so as my supervisor would say, we can declare victory. However, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what other questions should we be asking? I'll take a couple of questions from the audience if you have some in mind.
We have a technical question, which is, are these rubrics that you're talking about in this particular case common across multiple courses or in assignments, or are they specific to a particular assignment?
Okay.
I guess if I had a question, I'd want to know what role the students played in helping to create the rubrics that they were going to be using, and how the rubrics were shown to them prior to the completion of, like at the start of the project, so that they said, here's what you're going to be judged on and how you're going to be judged or graded prior to you taking it out, and have them play a role in helping to design them.
Okay, great questions. Great questions. Do you want to do the reveal, Karen?
There's a few other questions showing up in the chat.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So who are the 3% who didn't succeed? Do we see any demographic patterns? And then again, is there a pattern to who falls in the 3%, who scores what?
Well, yes. All of those great questions, all of those questions we should be asking. Absolutely. And there are results from the course, and many of you ask the very questions that we should be interested in. And we see that students, someone asked about the students who were, the 3% who were not doing well. And we see that there are at least 16 of those who were, or at least 5 of those on the 2 or 1 range. So we might ask ourselves, who are in the 4 and 5? Who are those in the 3 or less? And if anyone listened to Dr. Arbanoff, she impressed upon us the importance of drilling down to who scored poorly, on what did they score poorly, and why did they score poorly.
And Young A asked another question, which is, what is the score on each of the other criteria?
Yes.
And, you know, a question that I had is 3 or above, for me, is kind of a broad range. So a question that hasn't come up, but I'm interested in whenever I see SLO reports, is how many are 3s and how many are 4s and 5s?
Great. All right. On our next slide, we actually did a chi-square that measures the difference between the expected versus the observed outcome for populations. Now, in our definition, because we had small populations of Black and Hispanic students, what we did was we actually grouped students into what we call a underrepresented minority, or URM. You will see this throughout our presentation category. And the URMs are Black, Hispanic, Native American, and Pacific Islander students. And the non-URMs are Asian and white students. And as you can see that there are fewer URMs who score in that 4 to 5 category, and there are more, unfortunately, who score in the 1 to 2 category.
And in fact, the only students who didn't meet the acceptable criteria fell into the underrepresented ethnic minority category, which, you know, this is one SLO, but I think it underlines the importance of starting to disaggregate within SLOs, because if as an institution we're required to provide equal access to education for all of our students, and we're using assessment of student learning to determine the extent to which we're succeeding at that, to me, this indicates that there's a real need for using a more nuanced approach.
We've got some questions in chat about how faculty were trained on norming the scoring using this.
So that I can't answer right now, but I can ask and get back with you on that. But that is a good question about the norming. We do have, I'm not sure if this particular class did norming, but we do that process. So I do know what you're talking about, but we'd have to gather that information.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I'm Jill Kern. So, I mean, and this is a kind of bigger question, so maybe we'll take it at the end, but while I'm thinking of it, I mean, I have enough challenge getting faculty to do any assessment to then ask them to start breaking down the
the assessment results into disaggregating the data. Oh my God, that's a really, that's a real big, a big lift. So if we could address that at some point toward the end during this discussion, I'd love to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think we will get to that question at the end. And yes, okay. So our next area was, and I have that down, Jill. I'm not ignoring you. I wrote that down. The next question we wanted to ask is, okay, so we disaggregated at a course level. Do we think that that as you aggregate these courses over time to a program, degree, or certificate, that impacts students, whether it be semester or cumulative GPA? And overall, what we found is students who took that particular course is that there were some differences in GPA. And so we think that there might be some further investigation as to whether this particular course impacted the GPA, or if there are multiple courses where students perform, certain groups of students perform worse on assignment types. Do these actually accumulate over time and impact their entire GPA? All right, so we have time for a chat. And Harriet, are you monitoring this one?
Yes, I am.
Yes, and I'm not sure if we might not want to address Jill's question now, or if we want to save it till later, but if anyone has any other questions, we're leaving some space for that.
Well, we did have another question to come in. I think, Karen, did you want to take that since you responded? The question is where there are differences between URM and non-URM when looking at criteria separately?
Yeah, so I wrote back in the chat, but I think that, that's just from a general assessment standpoint, I'm deeply troubled by the fact that we're getting averages of 5 to 10 different criteria that have to be a 3 or above, because I think it just encourages a tax return mentality when we ask faculty to provide data at that level. And going back to Jill's question, I think our route to trying to engage faculty is doing the work we're sharing with you today to try and show that there's something important there. Ben Simon has talked about creating a culture of equity where you engage faculty by sharing meaningful data in engaging with the data to try and increase equity. And so, these are our first steps where we've gone in independent of faculty to demonstrate, or, using my own classes, things like that I taught previously, but to demonstrate that there's sort of rampant inequity and that it's important. And then our goal is, as we reach faculty with that data, and it's already been happening, faculty will choose to engage in doing that work with us.
So there's another question in the chat.
Yeah, so Jana Hansen is asking, do we need a control for other variables? And David Eubanks has made a great case for the importance of controlling for other variables. And absolutely, I think once, I'm a former faculty member. I know there's a lot of faculty members in the room with us today. I think once you engage faculty in the first steps, then oftentimes you can find really willing partners to do the fine-grained work that's necessary. And so we are not pretending that we've finished the story here at all. We're going to show you some limited first steps that we've done, but we think they make a compelling case for why you need to engage more fully. And just to explain that, the best work is going to look at things like academic preparation, the students' financial status, gender, as well as race, so multiple intersections, and that's where we're really going to unpack what's going on here. When in a student's, how many credits a student has completed, all those other variables.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions in the chat. There's a question that says, does the scoring, can it be done early and late in their journey in college?
So, you know, again, I think a best practice in assessment is you want to assess learning outcomes at multiple points. My own background is developmental psychology, and if we really want to know that we are improving education, we need to see change over time. That's not something that we're going to address so much in this talk, and we do have a lot of material to get through, so I'm going to keep us focused, I think, more narrowly on the issues that relate specifically to the data we're going to be sharing.
Karen, can you go back? You said something really fast about 10 things. You said, you know, 10 criteria and a tax form mentality. I didn't know what you're referring to, and I'd really love to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I actually just did another on-demand session where I dug into sociology learning outcomes. And so in the sociology learning outcomes, for example, at our institution, they have 10 different sub-elements of their oral communication rubric that are rated each on a 5-point scale. And for students to be deemed having competence, they need to average, they have to get a score of 5 or better out of 10, where each of the 10 elements, no, it's 5, I'm sorry, it's 5 elements. Each one can have a score of 0, 1, or 2, and they need a score of 5 or better. So you can get a 5 by getting zeros on half of the elements, right? And if at our institution and at many institutions, the only thing that's being reported, and this is what Christine was sharing in that early slide, is that average aggregated score. And faculty oftentimes are doing that to meet a requirement of the institution, as opposed to trying to learn about how to instruct better. And I think the more fine-grained our ask is, and you're right that it's hard to make that ask, but once we engage faculty, the more fine-grained the data is, the more useful it will be to them. Does that explain?
I totally get that now. That was really helpful. Thank you.
So there's another question in the chat, and it's a really good question. It talks about something really important is how to help faculty overcome unconscious bias before engaging with equity assessment and student outcomes. What are your thoughts about this?
I think that's crucial. I think as we move further in the talk, we're going to talk about how different forms of assessment appear to, I would say, evoke equity gaps more than other forms. And so I think one thing we'll all want to keep in mind as we think about what are those problematic forms of assessment is, in some instances, might it be that unconscious bias is playing a role? We are, though, almost an hour in, and so I think we probably should move on through, and we are going to continue to talk about these things. And I think me and my co-presenters would love to continue to talk about them offline if we run out of time.
All righty, so I'm up next. Excuse me. So, hi everyone again. My name is Harriet Hobbs, and I have the pleasure of talking about the model that we've developed. So Christine mentioned early on in the workshop that we submitted a paper to the assessment update back in the fall on culturally relevant assessment. So in the paper, we talked about the matrix, and we discussed several certain assignment types that can perpetuate achievement gaps. But in addition to that, we discussed, we juxtapose, I guess, best practices that helps reduce achievement gaps. So when you think about culturally relevant assessment, when we talked about the title, immediately I thought about the work, the seminal work that Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings has done in her scholarship and research of teaching and practice. I've heard several folks on the call talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy, and most recently, Montenegro and Jankowski proposed that culturally responsive teaching, as well as assessment, can be important practices for reducing equity gaps in student achievement. So as we go through the elements of culturally relevant assessment, keep in mind that all of these are considered best practices for all students. Most importantly, failing to consider each of these elements can interfere with the student's ability to do their best work. So let's talk about this notion of stereotype threat. So when you consider stereotype threat in the classroom, and stereotype threat is defined or described as situations in which individuals believe that they are at risk of conforming to a negative stereotype about their group. For example, when testing in classroom environments evoke stereotype threat, those affected show reduced performance. So in other words, any situation that forces students to highlight their race, ethnicity, or their gender, or their sexual orientation can evoke stereotype threat. And this can include writing this type of information at the top of the test. So thinking more about the elements of culturally relevant assessment, let's talk about inclusive content. Now for inclusive content, we want to be sure that assignments are well aligned with teaching and learning. So anytime we test students on information that we have not taught, we are disproportionately harming those students who may have less preparation or less confidence. So when we ask students to apply or demonstrate learning, that example should be, it's critical that that example is equally familiar to all students. So a small difference like a choice of unfamiliar content can interfere with the student's ability to do their best work. We must be sure that our assessment as well as our teaching are well aligned with the student learning outcomes that we are trying to achieve. Therefore, if assessment and teaching are poorly aligned, it will increase achievement gaps. So let's talk about clear instructions. We must be sure that instructions are clear and detailed. For example, when instructions are unclear, students who have stronger academic preparation will likely be able to understand the instructor's intention using their previous experience with similar tasks, whereas students from privileged groups may feel comfortable asking for clarification, while students from underrepresented minority groups or underrepresented groups may not feel comfortable asking for clarification. And this notion of scaffolding. Now, scaffolding limits effects of prior knowledge and creates opportunities for early success. This means that later assignments, we should give students an opportunity with later assignments that build on the knowledge and competencies that are practiced in early assignments. Early assignments should include detailed prompts, again with clear instructions that allow students to succeed. Scaffold assignments help students early on in the class, and it builds trust and prepares students to be able to persist when assignments become more difficult. Now I wanted to reference, because I heard a lot about culturally responsive teaching, I wanted to highlight some work that one of our partners did in terms of inclusive content. So in one of her particular assignments, it was in her theater class, and she asked students to participate in the project and wanted the students to relate the theories of drama to a movie, and she selected the movie of Wizard of Oz. So if you think about the demographics of your students and the type of students we serve now, she realized through conversation with the students that the Wizard of Oz, as many of us may be familiar with, the students were not familiar with that. But she talked with the students and learned that that movie was not equally familiar, and through their conversation, she learned that Shrek was a better choice because it was equally familiar to the type of students that were in her class. So even a small difference, as I said before, unfamiliar content can interfere with the student's ability to do their best work. But I also want to talk about high utility value. Now, increased utility value in assignment types is where students perceive assignments to have value to them beyond the context of a course or grade. There is a plethora of research that finds that when students are able to explain the importance of scientific material to their own lives, the research shows that there were reduced gaps in terms of equity for first generation students and underrepresented minority students. Next slide, please. So, and someone mentioned earlier before about disaggregation. I think it's important too that we must disaggregate results to be able to investigate the causes of achievement gaps. And I think it's only through this critical examination of data disaggregation that we can identify these gaps to be able to create and sustain systems of equity in terms of student learning. So given the previous elements from the previous slide about culturally relevant assessment, now let's take a moment and look at some strengths and weaknesses in terms of assessment types. So in reflective writing, now these are considered low risk in producing achievement gaps. And the reason why is because students are asked to provide or describe and apply content to their own life experiences, which are culturally inclusive. In addition, students generally report that these types of assignments are high in utility value. Therefore, you should expect to see less evidence of equity gaps in student achievement. Reflective writing, which consists of open-ended test questions, are better aligned with teaching and learning. So you can expect to see all students to express this in reflective writing, that students can express their learning in their own words. So let's talk about inclusive projects in terms of the analysis of the assignment types. Now with inclusive projects, these are of course high in inclusive content but low in utility value. And so students have selected in this type of project different ways of demonstrating the knowledge. Before I gave you an example of the different genre in theater that students can bring in to their learning experience from a different cultural background, and this provides students with choices that can be inclusive content. So writing in a discipline. Writing in a discipline is considered, for example, lab reports. And this is high in utility value because students who are writing in a discipline, they need the skill set in their place of employment. So they understand the value that writing in a discipline has to them. Even though it may be low in inclusive content, it is definitely high in utility value, high in utility value. Okay, so let's talk about formal essays and tests and homework. Now, multiple choice tests, which are frequently given in groups and can evoke stereotype threat, they also have complicated sentence structures, which is misaligned with what is being taught or what is and what is expected that the students learn. They also have time pressure and the lack of utility value because students typically perceive these types of assignments only for the purpose of a grade. Informal essays and homework type, as I said before, they lack inclusive content, are perceived as having low utility value. So you can expect to see, for these types of assignments, a reveal of achievement gaps. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are you looking at now? These are the predictions based on the analysis of different assessment types. So reflective writing is at low risk of producing achievement gaps. Again, students in reflective writing, students are able to describe and apply content to their own life experiences, which are culturally inclusive. And they generally report, students, that these types of assignments are high in utility value. Therefore, you can expect to see less evidence of equity gaps in student achievement. Assignments that are considered at moderate risk of producing equity gaps are open-ended test questions, and because they are better aligned with teaching and learning, allow students to express learning using their own words. And inclusive projects. Students have selected different ways of demonstrating knowledge, and it comes from their cultural background as well. And this provides students with a choice that can be inclusive. And writing in the discipline as well is considered moderate risk in producing equity gaps, because again, if students are provided this opportunity, this is the type of work to write lab reports that is required of them in the field that they so desire. And the assignments that are at high risk of producing equity gaps are multiple choice tests, which is often misaligned with teaching and learning. And again, this notion of stereotype threat. And students really look at these types of assignments as they lack high utility value because they have to fill in the bubble to do this for the contents in the course for a grade or the course. And then formal essays and homework both lack inclusive content and utility value. Even though these assignments are important to the students, they can be looked at from the lens of scaffolding, but they do lack inclusive content and utility value. Okay. Who's leading the chat? We have questions in the chat.
Major question was dealing with the operationalization of the equity value.
That is what we're going to do next.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, utility value?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think if we don't have a lot of chat, we are a little bit behind where we'd hope to be because there's been such great engagement so far. So are we ready to move on, Harriet?
Yes, I just want to make sure we address questions at some point, but yes, I know we have to move on, but yes.
And I think someone asked about student involvement, and Karen, that leads great into what you're just about to chat about.
Great. So yesterday, relatively late, I did send around a link to a survey, and that's the basis for this activity. I was going to give people a little extra time to go do it now so they could see, but I'm going to just move ahead. And this survey is actually part of an ongoing research project. So if you are interested in being in our research project, you can submit at the end. If you're not interested and just want to see our measure, you just have to say you consent, but then just never submit and you'll be fine. But the questions that I asked you to consider, those of you who did get to the survey, was what do you think the questions that you looked at are trying to measure? And what questions do you think would be getting at similar features of an assignment? And for those of you that already did it last night and listened to Harriet speaking, I'm hoping that you see some overlap with the two constructs, inclusive content and utility value, that she was just discussing. So to move us sort of quickly, just take a look at these 5 questions, which were 5 of the questions in the survey that you would have used to say, in general, this assignment does this, right? So to what extent, in general, do multiple choice tests result in something I will discuss with others, help me to understand myself better, have personal value, improve my understanding, or provide me with experiences that will be professionally useful? So again, moving us ahead, this is a single construct that emerged from research I'll be telling you about in a moment with students, where we did cluster analysis. But can somebody tell me what you see here? And if you want to be super sophisticated, why I have 4 different groups here? Because there's actually 3 different elements of this general construct. Everybody could go ahead and write into chat what they think it's measuring. Can you tell I've been in the classroom for a while? Still waiting. Utility value, Charlene, gold star. Okay, so these are the items that we designed and found do measure utility value. There are 3 subcomponents of utility value. So help me understand myself better and have personal value. What kind of utility value? And again, utility value is this value beyond doing it because you're told to. So value, so personal utility, and that is absolutely correct. So those 2 items are measuring this sub-construct of personal utility value. What about improve my understanding? Metacognition, excellent. Expectancy. The answers are visible in the slides? Oh no. Okay, well, that explains some of the quiet stuff. Glad I don't have this set up for too many of the other ones. Yeah, so the second piece of the construct is academic utility value. So how useful is this going to be to you as a student? And then I won't wait since you can all see it. The final is this idea of professional utility value. So provide me with experiences that will be professionally useful. The concept of utility value comes from Jacqueline Eccles. It's from around 1970s, and I have a reference at the end if you want to learn more about it. So then when we asked a large group of students to respond to these questions, we found that these items had a inter-item correlation of 0.9, which is very high. And so we believe that this does sort of emerge as a pretty good measurement, and I'll be telling you more about that in a minute. So how about these? And I'll just move through these a little more quickly, since you can see my sneaky content. Whoops. These we actually originally put in thinking we were measuring two different constructs. So in the assessment update paper that some of you have already read, we thought there was both alignment and inclusive content that were separate constructs. Our cluster analysis revealed that in fact they grouped together, and it caused us to go back to the drawing board. I love it when you learn from your data and think about it a little bit more. And what we think is that alignment is part of inclusive content, because when we lack alignment, students with privilege are more likely to either ask for clarification or to rely on past experiences to succeed on those tasks. And so students perceive these 6 questions as asking similar things, and we think they all relate to this one concept of inclusive content. So as I mentioned, we validated this measure with 162 students. They did pretty much the same survey that some of you went and saw. They came from a range of classes, and we had a pretty good distribution of underrepresented ethnic minority students, first-generation students. We're a little heavily female. And this is what we found. So for those of you who didn't make it to the survey, these were the types of assignments we asked students to rate. I'll just give you a moment to look at that. And this is what we found. So students were rating, as you did in the survey, on a 4-point Likert scale. And so it ranged from 1 to 4, with 4 being the strongest endorsement. And so this is now writing in the discipline on the bottom, oral presentations, inclusive projects, reflective writing, formal papers, short answer tests, and multiple choice tests on the extent to which students perceived them to have utility value. Analyses revealed that these were the significant breakpoints. So the critical value was 0.11. So any score that is more than 0.11 apart from any other score is significantly different from that score. And my boxes don't perfectly capture those significant differences, but they captured the trend. But what you'll see is writing in the discipline and oral presentations were viewed as having the highest utility value, followed by inclusive projects, reflective writing, and formal papers. And then short answer or free response tests were next lowest, with multiple choice tests having the lowest utility value. And here are our student responses to inclusive content. And the first thing you may notice is that there's much less variability. So if you just compare this curve to that curve, these numbers are much more similar to each other. And the only significant difference was that tests were viewed as having lower inclusive content than everything else. Those of you who have looked at different assignments in the classroom from a CTL perspective or a teaching perspective may have already realized that many students wrote in, we gave sort of a place you could make comments, that it was really hard to answer some of these questions for a general assignment. And what we believe is underlying this low spread in our scores is the fact that one person's assignment might have very strong inclusive content, you know, reflective writing or an essay or whatever, and another professor's will have very low. So students said it really depends on the faculty member for this more than the assignment. So just to go back to our model, we found that student views of, and, you know, our purpose here was to try and get a measure that would give a student perspective on utility value and inclusive content, because the existing work has relied on either faculty perspective on the assignments or sort of an analysis by a third party of the assignments. And so we wish to find out what students viewed. I just got a question about what is inclusive content. So inclusive content, I'm going to go back really quickly because it's kind of broad. It's the idea that the content gives everybody equal access to the materials. So, where am I? It needs to be aligned, because when it's not aligned with your SLOs and with what you've taught in the classroom, then previous knowledge gives some people privilege. It needs to have clear and detailed instructions, because when you don't have clear and detailed instructions, previous knowledge or privilege, so the feeling of comfort in asking the professor for clarification, is going to disproportionately give certain students advantage. And it needs to be scaffolded with what's been taught previously, so that you've taught the skills that are required for success on the measure. And then the content itself needs to be equally accessible to everybody as well. So for example, there's research showing that open source textbooks, where you don't have to pay for the textbook, is an important feature of inclusivity, because when you have paid textbooks, a significant proportion of students in the class that lack financial resources either won't buy the textbook at all, or won't have access to the textbook until their financial aid checks come through. So, you know, and Harriet mentioned the example of if you pick a movie, it should be equally familiar to everybody. So all of those aspects as well. I hope that clarifies. So let me just get back to where we were. And I see another question. This is so a question about the extent to which the assignments differ. So again, the purpose of asking students was, first of all, to create a measure. And then second of all, to find out whether students generally shared our opinions about how assignments vary along the dimensions of utility value and inclusive content. Some of you participated in the exact same survey that we've been asking professors and assessment people to do to address the same question. The next step, and really what's important, is to find out how students view particular assignments. And that work is currently underway. So our first group of faculty have asked students to complete those questions for assignments within specific classes, where the students know exactly what the assignment is. And that will be the next paper that we write. But we haven't yet. We don't have that data ready to present. So what I want you to notice is the one place that our model really shifted based on the student general feedback, not to any specific assignment, but to assignments in general, is that students reported that writing in the discipline is both high in inclusive content and high or moderately high in utility value. And so that's the one change here. So the research support, I'm going to move quickly through this also, because this is included in the paper we distributed last night, so you can go and read more about it there. But after we developed our hypothesis about the relative importance of utility value and inclusive content, we went back to a friend of ours classes who teaches theater, as Harriet mentioned earlier, and to two of my classes. And we looked at where there were equity gaps on assignments. And in this research, I rated my own assignments and analyzed my own assignments, and the theater faculty member analyzed her own assignments. So this did not include student input, but we did find preliminary support for the model. So in the theater appreciation class that you can see at the top there, which was minority majority, so it was 69% underrepresented ethnic and minority students. So that was including African American, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, and Native American. And in her class, she had a series of inclusive projects where students could actually select the genre that they wrote in, and they could select content. And she did not have equity gaps there. So these first two bars, the 90 versus 94% difference was not significant, but in her multiple choice exams, there was a significant equity gap. In my own class, which I dramatically redesigned to try and reduce equity gaps by relying heavily on self-reflective writing, where students took concepts from the course and used it to explain their own lived experience or the lived experience of somebody they cared about, and prioritized what information they wanted to recall. So it was designed to be inclusive and high in utility value. I had no equity gaps there. My online quizzes were open book, open note, low stakes quizzes where it was scratch off exams that students would get a quarter of a point even for trying. And if they got it right the first time, they got a full point, and each successive try, they got one fraction of a point less. There were equity gaps there. Taught the same class online with exactly the same test questions, and there were not equity gaps when it was an online quiz. And so Harriet talked earlier about this idea of stereotype threat, and the fact that the same quiz questions evoked an equity gap when they were taken in a large lecture hall with a white professor at the front, but did not evoke an equity gap when they were done online, to me supports that importance of stereotype threat. And I almost think that stereotype threat may be another feature that is subsumed under this idea of inclusive content, because if your testing environment isn't inclusive, that may be another barrier to success for some students. Finally, this is also in the paper, but experimental psychology, there was a really substantial equity gap in that class. And when I took over teaching it, I had the goal of every student passing the class and reducing equity gaps. And you can see the gaps here are not as large, and it's a little harder to see because this was an interaction. But there were two major forms of assessment in the class. Writing in the discipline, students had to write 3 or 4 complete lab reports where they did a literature review, designed, either were given an experiment or designed it as a class, collected data, analyzed the data, and interpreted the data using the literature. So these were completely authentic measures of what psychology majors should be able to do by the time they graduated. And then open-ended exams, which were essentially, students were given all the questions in advance that could be on the exam, and it was really testing the same learning outcomes as the lab reports were testing. And for non-URM students, they performed equivalently on the exams and the writing and the discipline. So these darker green bars, that 76 versus 80 was not significant, but for URM students, they performed significantly better on the lab reports, the writing and the discipline, than the open-ended exams. And for me, this was a very compelling finding because the more authentic measure was the one that didn't have the equity gap. And so, you know, as we get to wrapping up today, I think one of the things we have to talk about is, do we use tests sometimes when we don't need to use them? Or do we use forms of tests that are inappropriate? Because upon reflection myself, what I thought is, I don't care if somebody has memorized, you know, how to do a statistical analysis or what the conventional level of significance is. What I care about is that they can use their resources to successfully do it. And so in this class, I don't believe the test was adding something, but yet it was creating inequity. So just to show you the tentative research confirmation that we have for the model to date, you can see that writing in the discipline does appear to belong in this higher box along with reflective writing. Inclusive projects, again, really modest research support, but they seem to not be causing the equity gaps either. It's simply the tests that we seem to be finding problems with so far, and we haven't determined anything yet at this point about formal essays. So with that, we will move briefly to a chat before we go into a break, which we will probably keep relatively short. Do we have questions, comments, or thoughts?
One question that appears in the chat has to deal with disciplinary assignments. Is the inclusivity of these and the equity of these an issue of design of the assignment, whether the instructions are clear, or is it attributable to something else?
So that's the work we're trying to do right now. I think Harriet, Christine, and I believe that you can increase the inclusivity and the utility value of any assignment, and our final slides in today's workshop are our thoughts about how you do that. Nonetheless, any time that you have timed memorization, you know, those high stress environments, I think make it a little more difficult to do those things. So I think we still need to do more research, but what we believe is there are certain types of assignments that are naturally going to be more accommodating of inclusive content and high utility value than others. But even within some of the most difficult assignment forms, there's ways to increase it. Did that address the question?
Someone raised their hand, Karen.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Whoever raised your hand, please unmute and speak.
Yes, it's me. It's Milena from LaGuardia.
Hi.
Yeah, it's very interesting and very practical if we want to do it, like if we want to do it somewhere else, right? So I really appreciate that. But I always find very conflicting the language use of the word gap when doing equity assessment and access for students or success, or for students learning outcomes, whatever it is. And then looking around, I found that it has kind of like an implicit bias embedded into it, because when we look into in a gap, we're assuming that the underrepresented minorities, they need to reach, you know, they need to bridge that gap, right? Because they're below to the benchmark that should be expected and is usually reached, and for students who are not underrepresented minorities, right? So it's very conflicting. And I came across a word that it was introduced by Gloria, what is her name?
Ladson Billings.
About education debt, where if we, and it's really hard to use to change the whole language when we interpret studies and assessments we do. So I don't know if you have any like thoughts about that, and how do you overcome that and don't get too much into that issue of the gap?
Right. So, you know, within our own team, I know that when I started doing this research quite a long time ago, people said achievement gap. And then people raised the issue that it really should be considered an equity gap. And now you're raising the issue about gap. And, you know, one thing I think is critical to remember here is when we're talking about grades, the number grade you get, and if it's higher or lower, has really important consequences for your opportunities within a degree program, for your ability to complete the degree program, and for your opportunities after you graduate. And so to me, equity gap, I feel captures it pretty well, because when there's that difference, I'm not saying that a 90 necessarily, you know, I'm not comparing an underserved student to a privileged student in terms of what they should be, but what we're comparing is what faculty are giving that student, how they're evaluating that student. And if there's a gap in how they're evaluating students that is driven by privilege and not by ability, then I think calling it a gap is critical. And, you know, maybe somebody will come up with a better word, but to me it's critical, because if I, as a faculty member, found out, like I did in my experimental psychology class, that my underserved students were doing more poorly on tests, which didn't even measure what they really needed to succeed as psychology majors in my department, and they weren't showing evidence, you know, they weren't getting lower grades. There wasn't a significant gap, at least on the really authentic measure, that drives me to improve. And so I think sometimes calling a gap is important if you want people to take action. So, you know, calling what's happening right now with police injustice is important. And so, you know, but the language continues to evolve, and I'm not, I don't feel like I'm the author of good language. Our first, I think in the assessment update paper, we chose false achievement gap. That was before we got to equity gap, because, you know, again, I think it's really critical that we keep in mind that it's the faculty members' fault. It's the institution's fault. It's not the student's fault, but it is our fault, and we are failing when those gaps are there.
Right. If I can add to that, you know, I'm just thinking in terms of a historical perspective in terms of why achievement gap was developed. So if you think about, again, you can't move away from systemic, institutional, and structural racism. So in my program, we don't write from a deficit lens. So we write where we are talking about the achievement, but we know there is an equity gap. So that, and as Karen mentioned, that language has evolved, but that's where we are in terms of when we're looking at URM students who's compared to standardized tests, which they are not normed for URM students. You really have to understand the historical perspective and how race plays into this.
Thank you.
All right, do we want to take a, Karen, 5-minute, 4-minute?
So people tell me, you can write in the chat, do you need, we're at the halfway point now. I know we need a minimum bathroom break, and maybe like a shove a donut in your face break. Is 5 minutes enough, or do people need 10? 5 minutes? Okay, so it is 12:32. We will start at 12:37, and if you need more time, we will not call anybody out for not being back here. Go. Are you going downstairs? Yes. Would you be able to bring me more water when you come back? Okay. I have 3 minutes of break. Hmm? Could you bring my water down and bring it back? You're so funny. too.
Well, so far.
Mhm.
I just had a moment of panic. My computer shut off.
Oh no.
I just had to rapidly log in again.
I just went to check on my son to make sure he's still alive. He would stay in his room forever. So I was like, get up, get out, go eat, go walk the dog, do something else.
Christine, my son is still in his room and probably still in bed.
Yeah.
I checked
I
on my
said, give me 5 minutes. And I was like, I won't be back in 5 minutes, so set your alarm. All right. Do you want me to start, Karen? Are we good? Or do you want to give people a few more minutes? Oh, well, she gave it to me, so I guess I'm going to start. All right. In this next part, we are actually going to be presenting about some research that we've have been doing that we hope to submit for a paper publication soon. So we ask that you don't cite us yet, but as soon as we have submitted, we will and been approved, we will share a copy with you. Just ask. So what we did was we went into our learning management system, and what we wanted to know, where we started was with courses that had high DFW rates, so 30% or more, and that had 50 or more students. We wanted to find those courses that we thought would be most impactful. So we found that there were 88 courses who met that criteria. We reviewed those classes because what we wanted to understand is, did they have at least more than one differentiated type of assignment? And what we found out of those 88 classes, there were only 8. The other 80 classes used only one assessment type, which fell into the category of tests, quizzes, and exams, which we had found had low utility value and low inclusive content. So all of the 8 classes that we were going to talk to you about today had differentiated assignments. Every one of them included a test, exam, or quiz, but they had at least one different assignment type. So how did we do it? How did we go about thinking about this? So again, we used our LMS system. We looked at we were able to extract grade information. They folks had posted syllabi, so we were able to evaluate what the assignment descriptions were. What we want to suggest to you, in some cases, we had classes where there were low enrollments. So if we found faculty members who had taught the same course over a period of time and used the same assignments, we merged those sections over a period of years. The other thing you want to think about is, oh, and I also should say, in some section or in some courses, they have a standardized set way of teaching. So in that case, we might have merged that information as well if you had different faculty members, but there was a standard set of assignments. The other thing you want to think about is decide whether you're going to include zeros or those who have missing assignments, and whether or not you're going to include courses or assignments that where folks just give a check mark, you did it or you didn't. And that just means that the work was completed or not. We, in our case, when we talk about homework, we did aggregate assignments. There could have been 2 or 3 or 4 or maybe even 10, but we called them homework in general. We did not say homework 1, homework 2. So we did aggregate those. And we did convert, we had to convert points to percentages to be consistent. And lastly, we asked our institutional research persons to use their student information system to align and use and add demographics to our file. Next is, we want to just tell you about the 8 classes that we identified. So the first 4 really are intro classes. So mathematics, communication, an engineering course, and accounting. And then the last 4 courses are a little more advanced. So chemistry, information technology, psychology, and sociology. And what you noticed is every course has some type of exam, quiz, or test, as we indicated previously. But as you get more advanced, they start to add different types of assignment types other than exams, tests, and quizzes. So let's talk about our demographic information. So we did want to look at, you'll see the total column and then you'll see transfer. We are an institution that has a high number of transfer students. So we wanted to look at transfer students, and in what we call them at our institution, when we do a comparison, it's transfer versus native students or those who began with us. And then we also separated out by demographic. But as I indicated, because the numbers were small, we did combine African American, Hispanic students and Native American students into a category that we would call URM, and white and Asian students into a separate category, which we call non-URM. And Karen, this is you.
So, still chewing my lunch.
Sorry, I didn't mean. I was trying to go
I thought you'd talk a little slower than that. If there's food in my teeth, please tell me.
Okay.
So now we're going to take you through the data. For those of you who aren't data happy, I will try and explain as clearly as possible. But my goal really is to have every one of you engage with this data and think about it as if you had collected it yourself. And so please either unmute yourself when I ask a question or write it in, and I'll share it out and we'll think about this together. So I know this is a lot. I will orient you. What you can see here, and we haven't really talked about this explicitly yet, but in the work we've done and the work from the keynote speaker, Dr. Kina Arbuthnot, I can't say names. Say it for me, Christine.
Arbuthnot. You have to be very slow.
Yeah, I think if it was written in front of me, I think I could have gotten it. Arbuthnot. Equity gaps oftentimes appear for multiple different underserved groups. And so, you know, a lot of the research on this has found first-generation students experience inequity in grades. In our own research, as you're going to see, students who transfer to the institution can be underserved by the institution. In Dr. Arbuthnot's work, women were showing gaps similar to African American students in the United States. And so across all the graphs we're going to look at, the first two bars are comparing non-URM students in Kelly green to URM students in paler green, and then comparing native students, which is the term used to refer to students who begin their college education at your institution, to transfer students. So those are those 4 bars across within each class. And within non-URM and URM students, roughly half of them are transfer students, although it's, you know, I think there's slightly higher proportion of transfer students that are also URM students, right? So we're not, given the size of our samples, we were not able to look at the intersection of those 2 variables, but in the best case, you would look at that as well as sex as a variable and those cross intersections. Then the way we have our classes listed, you can see each class shows its data along the bottom separately in order of how advanced the class was. So the far left, that math class was a 1,000 level class. The sociology class on the far right is a 4,000 level class. And roughly the first 4 classes are introductory, whereas the last 4 classes are more advanced classes. Up here at the top, and I hope you can see this, we have the percentage. And as Christine mentioned, we're using percentages because across classes, different assignments have different weights, and we didn't want it, if you used points, that would show differences that weren't relevant or interesting. So first, looking at this, what do you see? And if you have any other questions, if I haven't oriented you enough, please tell me.
Karen, can you talk to the percentage of what is a question in the chat?
Thank you. So what we're first looking at is what the vast majority of institutions stop at. So this is final course grades. So the final course grade would be out of 100. So anything 90 and above would essentially be an A. And these are averages for those groups.
Does it mean still better?
No, this is, so if your average over here for the first column is 76, in most institutions, getting a 76% for your final grade in the class would translate into a C. But here the average class grade was 90%. In most institutions, that would translate into an A or an A minus. But what I want you to tell me here is, what do you see in terms of, you know, do we see things that look like equity gaps? Does it seem to be uniform across classes? Are there some classes that seem to be more of a concern than others? Are gaps similar for transfer students as for URM students? So it says the non-URM and native students seem to end with final class grades higher. No. What's confusing is that I thought these were high. Okay, that's a great question. So the question is, if they were high DFW classes, why are there these high grade averages? We went a little quickly through this, but we identified the 88 classes as classes that at least one section being taught once in the past 2 years had that DFW rate of 30% or higher. But then when we went in, we looked at every offering of every class. And as Christine mentioned, 80 out of the 88 classes we looked at were graded only with tests. So we pulled the 8 classes that at least one person once taught using some differentiated forms of assignments. And those are the data that we're sharing here. And the reason we think those classes are still relevant is if you have one faculty member teaching a class with very high failure and DFW rates, and another professor can teach that class with an average grade of 90%, then we still think there's something interesting to learn. So I'm interested in knowing what comprised the course grade in each case. We're going to dig into all the assignments, but right now I just want you to start thinking about data. And if you need me to talk you through this one, I will. But let's just first, let's take which class has the biggest difference in the bars across the 4 bars. Okay, so we got engineering seems more difficult. Yep. So the average course grades in engineering that you can see here are a lot lower than everybody else. Somebody else says, were you surprised about the gap in math? So the size of the gaps that I see in math here aren't that big, right? Because it would be 76% versus 75%, comparing non-URM to URM, and 76% versus 75% comparing transfer to native. Where does somebody see a big gap? Okay, information sciences and sociology have big gaps, yes, right? So, and you know, I know it takes some time to orient to graphs, but as you can see here in this information sciences class, underrepresented minority students averaged 84%, whereas non-underrepresented ethnic minority students averaged 90%. Transfer students averaged 87% for their final grade, non-transfers averaged 89%. And here for sociology, we have 70% versus 77% and 71% versus 76%. Somebody's writing, yes, that doesn't make as much sense as chem, but we have a problem too. So now, this isn't, this data we should remember is from one instance of a class. So the goal of this workshop is giving you an opportunity to look at disaggregated data and think about what might you do with it, or what might you learn from this. But this sociology data is absolutely not suggesting that every sociology class is going to have a big equity gap. It's suggesting that in this particular class, there might be a big equity gap.
I think Anne hit your answer, Karen.
Anne?
Yep, if you see it in chat, if
Excellent.
I'm reading your graphs correctly.
And I really would love it if you unmute yourself and talk, people.
Okay.
But thank you, Christine. Yes. So if I'm reading your graphs correctly, in all cases, URM students and transfer students have lower grades. Yeah. And sometimes the differences aren't big, but to us, that was kind of stunning. When we look at final grades in every single class, the direction of difference is inequitable. Let me see what else. Quick clarification. So the transfer students were non-URM transfer students? No. So the transfer students actually had a higher proportion of URM students than non-URM students. So these are two different ways of dividing our sample. We were not able to create the 4 panels of a complete 4x4 comparison, given our sample size.
Karen, another question about the type of math. Was it stats?
No, it was pre-calc, I think. Christian, do you remember? It was a very or might have been algebra. It was a very introductory class,
Yes.
1000 level class. So I think we're getting the hang of it. What I want to show you is when we ran statistical analyses using independent samples t-tests to compare just the pair, right? Compare URM to non-URM or compare native to transfer, which in a specific class. These boxes are showing you the differences that met conventional levels of significance of 0.05 or less, or were marginally significant. And given the fact that we had unequal sample sizes and a pretty high level of variability, we're showing you both the ones that were statistically significant as well as those that reached marginal levels of significance. And we're going to keep this in mind, and now we're going to dig into individual assignment types, unless there's any questions that I missed that I should address before I move on. I see in this one instance is for groups of classes that have high DFW rates. I'm sorry that I haven't explained this clearly. So we identified the classes we were going to look at as ones that had high DFW rates at least once when they were taught. We're a large institution with 30,000 students, and so each of these classes has been generally taught by multiple people multiple times. Once we identified those classes that, at least in one offering, had the high DFW rate, then we looked at the classes to determine which offerings had differentiated assignments, because we were interested in looking to see whether equity gaps were equivalent across different forms of assessment and assignments. Sometimes those classes still had the high DFW rates, like engineering here, and sometimes they didn't. So hopefully that clarifies. And the reason that we did the work the way we're doing it, and that we suggest that if you want to start this at your institution, that it might be something you want to do, is this was independent of faculty. So we really were going in from a system level to look to see across the system, what is the landscape. As we share this with faculty, we've gotten faculty who've come to us and wanted to do it in their own classes. And so this is a starting point that allows you to go in a meaningful way without having to have the faculty partners yet. Okay, so now, and there was the question of what were the assignments given. Let me just go back there for a second.
Well, you have one, Karen, about the level of significance, 0.05 or 0.01.
So the levels of significance are not here. Once we share the paper, you can see what they were for each one, but they were either 0.05 or 0.10. So we're sharing marginally significant effects because we think in terms of using this in a real world setting, those effects might still be worth knowing about. And here's the types of assignments. So even in those 8 classes, as Christine pointed out, everybody's including tests, quizzes, or exams. And then as you get into the more advanced classes, the bottom 4, you see more different types of assignments being used. So are we good to move forward now? Okay, so now, well, this is where most people stop. And the point that we're hoping everybody's going to leave the workshop with today is that you should go deeper. So the next slide I'm going to show you is the 7 classes that included multiple choice exams. And so everything else is the same here, except rather than final grades, now you're seeing multiple choice exams. And just in the name of time, these are the differences that reached either conventional significance or marginal significance. And what do we see here? And while you're thinking, there's the question of protecting faculty identities, and absolutely we are doing that by not identifying the person who taught it. And at our institution, multiple people are teaching these classes. We also, I'm sorry?
The gaps are even bigger now.
Yeah, so these gaps are definitely bigger. Are they everywhere? So engineering classes were not significant with the gaps they had. Yeah, that was stunning, right? Huge gaps, but not significant. And that has to do with high levels of variability and also uneven sample sizes. My recollection is in engineering, our underrepresented ethnic minorities sample was relatively small, which reduced the power of the analysis. One thing that I believe, and you have to make your own decision about this, but when you're talking about working on the front lines with faculty, I don't think significance is that important. If I were an engineering faculty and there was that gap, I'd want to know it, and I'd want to do something about it. What else do we have? So larger equity gaps. What about ITCS? Or communications? Math had open-ended exams, so I'm going to show that in a minute. Somebody asked what happened to the math class. So they were the only class that didn't have any multiple choice exams. Somebody's agreeing the magnitude is important. Okay, so what I take from this is multiple choice tests look pretty problematic, right? So this confirms to me some of my earlier suspicions that multiple choice tests, and a lot of research has said standardized tests are problematic in terms of equity. But it also says to me that it's not uniform, right? So you can have, again, in every instance, the underserved group is receiving lower grades than the privileged group, lower average grades. But in some classes, those differences are tiny, 2 percentage points, 1 percentage point, and in others, they're enormous. And so the question came up earlier, what can we do if we're limited to tests, if we teach math, something like that? This shows that there can be a lot of variability. Any other thoughts about this? Now I'm going to compare multiple choice tests to the few open-ended tests that we had. Was there any other analysis done on the difficulty? Okay, so test blueprint, somebody brought up. Next thing we want to do. So absolutely, within multiple choice tests, one of the things that I think is crucial to do is to go down to the level of item. So don't just disaggregate the grade, but disaggregate item levels and see which of your test items are causing those disparities. Okay, so now this one's a little bit confusing. You'll see at the bottom, this is the math class that had free response tests, free response exams. The engineering class, free response tests and free response exams. And then I just put in the engineering multiple choice quiz again. Actually, on the last slide, I had their multiple choice exam because on the last slide, I picked the highest stakes one to show. But this is a really different picture. So what do we see here? And none of these differences met conventional levels of significance. So in 4 cases, multiple choice seemed problematic. In 3 cases, they were not. No. So the only multiple choice test that's shown on this slide is this final set of bars, the engineering multiple choice quiz. All of these other bars are showing free response tests.
They said the previous slide, Karen, on the previous slide.
In 4 cases, multiple choice seemed problematic. Yeah, it was something like that. I'm not going to go back now, but yeah. So what do we see on this one? Equity gaps are diminished in non-multiple choice deliveries. Yeah, and way more than I even thought they would be. So, you know, I mean, look at this engineering free response test, dead even. They're doing poorly. Everybody's doing poorly, but there's no equity gap. And that's the same class that's showing enormous equity gaps in the multiple choice testing. And in their higher stakes free response exam, there is more of an equity gap here. Again, none of these met levels of significance. But this to me is pretty strong evidence across a number of classes that free response tests may be substantially more equitable in terms of their ability to assess learning than multiple choice tests. So I was asked, were you able to compare multiple choice to free response for the same expected outcome? Because we did this work independent of the faculty member, we aren't able to know what outcomes are being assessed by any measure. As I mentioned earlier, we're now partnering with faculty and we'll be able to do those sorts of analyses in the next wave of work that we're doing. So now homework, and I'll just go right to showing you where the significant gaps were. You'll recall that we predicted homework might be somewhat low in utility value, especially if it doesn't have very many points, because students don't view it as important to their final grade. And the inclusive content, it was sort of similar to many other assignments other than tests. So Jill Kern is writing, what's interesting is that people are inclined to believe multiple choice is more objective than free response. This shows that that's not the case. We need to rethink our concept of objectivity. Yeah, and you know, multiple choice tests, unless they're really well constructed, have all kinds of problems with alignment in my experience. And then Janice.
Yes, young son raised her hand.
I'm sorry, I have a very quick question about, again, the percentages. So those are percentages of scores. So 90, for example, 91% over 100% of the course grade. So wouldn't that mean that grades below like 60 or like 50, those are really, so in some of the previous slides, even though there's no big gaps, we do see that in some groups, the average is less than 50%, or it's less than 60% or 53%. So wouldn't we also shouldn't we also be looking at that, because that's a fail rate, so they're not passing the course? Is that correct?
Well, now, so the first slide I showed you was their final grade in the course. And so, you know, in most courses, and I'll go back here just to remind everybody, the percentage of grade that's determined by various assignments varies, right? So if you look here, in most of the classes, tests are responsible, 30% is in sociology or 5% in chemistry, but most of them are in the 70s to 80% of the classes determined by those test grades. You can have a huge gap in homework that may not drive a gap in your final grade. So you could say, well, that doesn't matter then. I believe it does matter, because I think, you know, if you think about culturally responsive pedagogy, part of culturally responsive pedagogy is having students believe that you believe they can succeed on difficult tasks. And every time a professor gives back a grade, or a learning management system pops out a grade, you're speaking to the student in a way that feeds their identity. So even if homework is worth a small percentage of the grade and may not lead to failure in the class, getting 50% of your homework's incorrect and getting that low feedback repeatedly influences your sense of belonging in the class and your comfort with asking the professor for help or clarification and all those other sorts of things. Did I address your question, Young-A?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. I was a little bit confused about.
I know, and I'm sorry.
Thank you. No.
It's a lot of data I'm trying to bring you through. And as Christine said, once the paper is available, you know, we really are happy to share it out. And, you know, there's pages and pages of explanation for all this that it's hard to fit it in now. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how we're thinking about the data. So Kent points out that free response is likely a better measure of learning. So now I'm going to move us, okay, so homework. Christine, 6 months ago, said to me something about how her son just decided he wasn't going to do the homework one day because he needed a mental health day. He's a middle school student, and it wasn't worth very many points. And I didn't mention this to you, but one of the questions that we originally had in our utility value measure was, I do it for more than the grade. And students across the board said they don't do anything for more than the grade. So it wasn't a good measure, but it made us think about homework and how, because oftentimes you have multiple homework assignments that are each only worth a point or two here or there, students view them as having low utility value, but the purpose of homework often is to practice skills. And so there's two ways that homework bites students. The first is, if you skip the homework, you're missing the practice, which leads to less good performance later on and less good mastery. But the second is, if you skip all the homeworks, those 2 points a day can add up to something significant. So here, and I meant to go ahead here, we are seeing you know, some significant equity gaps, and I would say a fairly high level of disparity, even aside from the equity gaps we're seeing. And once again, I think you can all see that in every instance where there's a difference, the difference favors the privileged group. Still, in some instances, you know, it's very even. So, you know, I'm very interested, this math class, my hunch is that maybe in math, students view homework as more essential because that's drilled into them throughout high school, and maybe some of the math faculty can think whether they think that's true. But you know, that's something I think might be going on here. And Anne is saying, missing the opportunity for feedback that Dr. Arbuthnot stressed is so important for high context cultures. Yes. So I'll keep going unless anybody has anything else here. So then the last group of assignments we looked at were writing, and these types of writing actually fall in different places in our predictive model. So in the communications class, students had to do, I think it was 6 in-class writing that tested their reading, you know, like if they had if they read what they needed to before class and understood it enough. In chemistry, huge, I think it was 75% of the grade was based on lab reports. So that's sort of like my experimental psychology class. And in the sociology class, students had to write 2 or 3 formal essays, you know, sort of in your classic, you know, use the literature to make an argument style. And these are significant differences. Any thoughts? What is happening in the sociology class? Yes. Yeah. And the sociology class was actually health disparities, which that class topic area has been proposed as a great class to increase representation in STEM areas. People have done really successful sort of experimental classes as ways to reduce equity gaps, because the content is actually about the effects of privilege on health disparities. And it's doing a lot of what we generally think of as good forms of assessment. So writing, and, you know, it's very limited. It had very, like 20% was test-based or something like that.
We have another question, Karen. The question is, for writing and open-ended assignments, did you examine marking rubrics or guides? Were the writing assignments marked by instructors or student TAs, teaching assistants?
So again, because we did this independent of the faculty, we don't know how they were graded. There was some instances where I was able to review rubrics, and Harriet, you might remember also, we both went through the materials that were available. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which classes posted their rubrics. But wherever there were rubrics, I did look them over to try and, you know, get a sense of how to classify the assignment.
Right. You have a second. There were not many to follow up with your question, Karen. But there's a second question. Are communication and psychology assignments likely related to genre conventions? Which is a really good question.
So the in-class writing, there were very little instructions that I was able to see in terms of what students were told about that. The sociology essays, what I did see made me classify it as a formal essay. And I don't remember if it specifically said following APA style or anything like that. But, you know, it was sort of a cite literature and make an argument about this type of an assignment. And, you know, you guys are all pointing to where we're going next, which is talking to faculty and talking to students. So I have 2 faculty from community college who this semester had students complete that survey that some of you did about the assignments in their classes. It was a biology class and a psychology class. So that we're going to find out what students thought about the assignments, and the faculty are my partners. And we've been accepted to present that research at Assessment Institute in October, which is now actually open and free. So I encourage you all to register and come to that session. Okay, so I'll keep moving. So now I'm going to show you a summary of what we've done so far. And this is a different sort of a graph. What you can see here are the number of points in percentage points, separating the assignments for URM versus non-URM and transfer versus native. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is, you know, I don't feel like this evidence can conclusively support our matrix, but as we went through the data, we wanted to sort of see what's the overall picture, right? And I don't feel like it's legitimate to analyze this data by aggregating all of the test grades, because, you know, you saw there's a lot of variability in the tests and we don't know enough about what's happening in the classes. But the general picture that emerges for me here is confirmation that multiple choice tests seem to be dangerous, if I'm going to speak bluntly. Homework also, you know, I think Christine's son gave us some important insight on the fact that people think about homework, and there's research that shows that giving students frequent low stakes assignments can support their learning, but I think we need to be really careful about finding ways to make sure the utility value of that work is clear to students and that the work is inclusive, because and remember, by the way, that we're including 0 grades here. So a lot of these disparities are driven by disproportionate numbers of zeros. And yeah, so that's sort of generally what's coming from this. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Or I'm going to move to the final group of assignments, and then we're going to move to our wrap up. Okay. So there were 3 other assignments that only appeared in one class. And so I think the conclusions that we can draw are somewhat limited when we only have one class to go on. But you know, they were interesting nonetheless. So students had told us that they thought, and this surprised me, that they really valued oral reports. So they said oral reports are really high in utility value and really high in inclusive content. And there was one oral report where students had to pre-record like something like this, right? So they had to do a YouTube type of presentation, and it was evaluated using a rubric. And there were no equity gaps in that. And in fact, you can see one of the rare instances of a reverse equity gap here, where transfer students actually received higher grades than native students. Again, not significant differences, but if we're just looking at the trends. This group project in the accounting class, I think probably had quite high utility value. It was a Shark Tank project where students worked in a group and they had to pitch, you know, some business idea and have the full accounting plan. And that's the only significant reverse equity gap that we saw across every assignment we looked at. So underrepresented ethnic minority students are averaging 91, and non-underrepresented ethnic minority students are averaging 86 on that. And students were individually evaluated on that, so it wasn't like a whole group grade. And the reverse pattern is true for transfer students as well. So to me, you know, can't draw conclusions, but it does support somewhat the idea that utility value may be important here. And then in this computer science class, we actually saw 2 years that were taught by the same faculty member. And originally we aggregated them. And then we saw that there was this one extra assignment that the faculty member added in the subsequent year, so the later of the 2 years. And the addition of that assignment led to an equity gap in the final grade. And it was in-class activities. And I think this is really interesting because in-class activities are another tool, especially within STEM, that we try to use to increase equity by engaging students more completely. And I don't know what was going on there, but 83 versus 70, that was where there was the equity gap in that class, and that's what drove the final grade difference in that class. So, you know, it's interesting. Any comments, questions, or thoughts? We're done with the data. So if you have anything you want to talk about data, now's your chance, and then we're going to move on to sort of what do we do with this.
I have a comment about what you just mentioned. I'm Milena from LaGuardia, about the in-class activities in the STEM courses. It's really hard to facilitate those classes without doing, you know, damaging stereotypes or like making students believe that they don't have what it takes to be good. Yeah. And then in those cases, it's really important, like if we're going to be using activities in class, to be developed and learn on how to deal with that facilitation. Otherwise, it's just counteractive. It's just going to the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think, and you know, those of you from teaching and learning centers, almost every time I've seen a faculty member, especially a relatively new faculty member, try and integrate active learning, especially into large classes, it's a bumpy road. And so we really need to, you know, if we're working with faculty, we need to work with them generally over 3 years even, where you look really carefully at what's happening in those assignments. Most of us have a confirmation bias. So if we're in a room with 100 students, we're going to notice the 40 in the front who are engaged in doing it, and we can miss, you know, the 60 at the back that aren't. And so disaggregation and helping faculty to get an accurate picture of what's happening in those chaotic active environments is critical.
So Karen, a couple of questions in the chat. Someone mentioned, I wonder if that was an attendance issue.
Yes, I do too.
And then another question is, did you include, let's see, they're coming in, Did you include ethnic group of the faculty member in the consideration, URM versus, non-URM versus URM instructors?
We did not access that data. We probably could get it from institutional research. You know, our approach, and this is critical for any of you who are in offices of assessment and accreditation, and somebody already mentioned the faculty member's privacy. We're trying to look at our institution. We're really not trying to single out any faculty member. And, you know, we want to work with faculty partners, and we feel pretty strongly that this exploratory work reveals that there's widespread issues that need attention. But I think that the three of us, and contradict me if I'm wrong, Harriet or Christine, but I think I would have felt uncomfortable accessing private information about the faculty member. And, you know, so I think it's an interesting question, but we did not address it.
Yeah, without their consent. I think in order to do that, we want to, for me, I want to bring in faculty who are really passionate about these gaps and trying to have interventions for students. So we would then have to have a conversation with them to make sure they're on board with this, and again, to make sure we go through that IRB process.
So I see Anne raised the point of the importance of teaching students how to participate and engage in in-class activities. And I think, you know, that's a really great point, that students with privilege are more likely to have experience with more active types of settings, or potentially students from high context cultures, as Anne is pointing out. But when we're talking about being inclusive, being really explicit about what is it that you as a faculty member are expecting to demonstrate competence, right? So, and part of that is to succeed in an activity, what is it that the student needs to do? So that's the inclusive piece. Make sure you really explain it and teach it what it is you want them to do. And then the second piece is the utility value piece, and explain to them how it's going to be useful to them personally, academically, and professionally, the skill that they're going to get through that activity. I had a question about the assignments in the previous types. Did you check if rubrics were used, etc.? So again, that goes to whenever there were rubrics that were on the learning management page, we reviewed them, and it varied widely whether or not they were present.
Karen, there's another question prior to that. I also wonder about the makeup of the groups doing projects or activities, how that affects the performance. We know that stereotype threat occurs based on group makeup.
Yes, absolutely. You know, all questions you can't get at in the sort of research that we described here. I could get, you know, the assessment update paper that was done with my classes and with another faculty member's classes who was involved with us. And so in those instances, we could answer all that question. And in the research that we're just, you know, we've just finished collecting data but haven't analyzed, we'll be able to ask those questions.
Okay, a couple of more. Did these data include students from different academic years? I wonder whether experience and familiarity with activities influence the results.
So absolutely, and we actually do have, I think we have the number of credits the student has completed, so that we could, you know, have a rough measure of years. We were happy that we included classes that ranged from introductory classes through advanced classes. And so, you know, if you go back to some of these ones where we have like the multiple choice exams or the homework, as you move to the right, these are the more advanced classes. And what you can see both here in homework and here on multiple choice tests is the equity gaps are actually more frequently present in those more advanced classes. So it's not, you know, as a developmental psychologist, I would hope that if students came in potentially with different levels of preparation as they moved through required classes to advanced classes, the institution would have brought students to equivalent levels, but it doesn't appear that that's happening.
We have another question. I've been thinking a lot about how to approach faculty, such as those who teach these high DFW courses. Is it better to have a systems person lead that discussion or data?
I'm not sure what a systems person is. Do you know what that
was
mean?
my question. From like a system, meaning like we have the UNC General Administration. Is that what you're referring to, or someone from a different department?
No, I was thinking more of on a systems level. For us, it might be a provost level, but you know, how do you make that choice of bringing in someone at a higher institutional level versus having someone in a unit that's like mine, where it might be considered butting in?
So I think Ben Simon has published really beautiful stuff on this, but the goal is, I think, is to create this culture of equity where you're engaging faculty through data in the issues. And every time we've given a workshop or a talk on this data, at least one faculty member has come forward and asked to work with us to see what's going on in their own classes. So I think, you know, the best way to reach faculty is to share, you know, the assessment update paper is a baby paper, this next paper that we're going to publish. Other people have done work on this, but actually showing data that shows that it's going on, because the faculty members who are reachable, right? The faculty members, the majority of faculty members do not want to be unjust, and they want their classes to be equitable. And those faculty, when they see this, will be sitting there thinking, is it me? You know, like after I started doing this, I went through every single class I've ever taught and started looking at it. And, you know, like I cared deeply about this stuff for my entire life. And I taught for 20 years and didn't notice some of the gaps that were there. I think I started noticing them like 10 years into teaching. So I really do think you engage faculty by showing the data and raising the questions.
So I'm wondering if there's a difference between showing, say, for instance, your research, or I've heard recently from Jennifer Meta Robinson, who's doing some data research, and is it less threatening if it's research on other faculty, as opposed to if you present this on your campus and that person who does accounting or accounting classes in the room, how would they feel? So I don't know if do you address that with the classes represented?
We've shared some of our data from, you know, that assessment update paper on our campus. We haven't shared this yet. So, you know, I do think it could feel sensitive on our campus. I've done previous work consulting in my previous institution with the biology department, where I did somewhat similar work on Bio 1, where there were really high failure rates among underserved students. And, you know, once the data were there, the faculty, they were smart faculty, they pushed me, right? Well, how do we know it's the same learning outcome? And those are the conversations you have. But those are important conversations, right? If it's not the same learning outcome that's being measured by the different forms of assessment, then you need to come up with equitable forms of assessment that measure the learning outcome you're thinking about.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Jump in for a sec. So I apologize. Son came to the door and said, I don't know how to use the can opener. So I had to go open a can and come back. So I thought it'd just give you a laugh for a minute. I also want to say that our office offers the opportunity, and if this has been said before, Karen and Harriet, please stop me because I hate repeating the story.
What hasn't?
Okay, but we do offer what are called scholarship of assessment grants. And based on upon our work this year, we offered, they're $1,000 grant that, you know, faculty sometimes don't teach during the summer or don't get paid during the summer. So these are summer grants for them to work on research questions that they have about their own class. So this year we specifically said, we didn't give all of them away in relationship to assessment and equity, but we did give a couple away after we had, you know, put that as part of a criteria. We have other criteria, but we did give a couple away. And so I do want to reiterate that what Karen said is there are some people who are interested, and those are the folks that we want to support in their effort in moving forward. So again, it's not a lot of money, but faculty really go for that $1,000 for the summer. It really is helpful for them.
So just to circle back on a few questions, somebody raised the issue of how do we get students to do low stakes assignments. There was really interesting research done on an intro psych class, I think it was, where they had everyday low stakes assignments, but they paired that with everyday a direct communication to the student that said how their work and completion of those assignments was influencing their final grade. And so I think, you know, a difference, I think this is a big difference for first generational students versus students from continuing generation families, is that attention to how all the different various components of a class are feeding into the final grade. And so really explicitly, you know, when I used to introduce classes, I would say, you have this weekly assignment. If you don't do this weekly assignment, your highest grade in the class possible is going to be a B. And if you don't do this weekly assignment, you could earn a C but get a D for the class, right? So, you know, really making it explicit, but then giving student, and, you know, with learning management systems, it's very easy to do. But in some learning management systems, the students have to check their grades in order to see it. And there's a lot of variability in how much students go to check their grades. So leveling the playing field by making those communications explicit, I think is key, and giving students ongoing information. Also, creating systems where, you know, like a lot of faculty are like, you have to do it by this date or it's not accepted. Sometimes that's important, right? If you need to do a pre-lab quiz so that you can succeed on the quiz, then you need to do it that way. But if the pre-lab quiz would still be a benefit after the quiz, then maybe give half credit if they do it after the quiz, because then at least they're still getting that practice if it is something that's useful. So I think sometimes faculty don't fully examine the consequences of their grading decisions on getting students to do work that has implications beyond even the grade in the class. See if there's other questions. Oh, how do we determine what was URM and non-URM? So we used the groups that NIH and NSF have said have been historically underserved in higher education in the United States that were present at our institution. So at our institution, we had, I think we had one Native American student, and then we had groups of Hispanic and African American students. We did not have any Pacific Islander students, but we would have included that in the group as well. And we only had the classification of Asian, which it's difficult to know where exactly that falls, but we included white and Asian students in our non-URM group, and we excluded students we had incomplete information on. So some students showed up as international students, or it was unreported, and those were excluded from that analysis. So I think that's, did I miss anything?
Yeah, that's a question about how many students were in the class, or either our data set. I'm not sure if they were talking about class, which particular class.
I'm not going to go back to that slide now. I will send it around, and that shows you the breakout of all the numbers of students across the classes. I think our total sample was 695 students across the 8 classes, but you can review that when we email that out, because I do want to have enough time for our conclusions. So just in summary, you know, we found frequent equity gaps in testing. This was true. I didn't really go into this here. We flesh it out a little more in our paper, but that was regardless of if the tests were low stakes or high stakes. So it wasn't clear that exams were worse than tests or tests were worse than quizzes. We definitely saw a pattern where it seems that multiple choice tests, even within the same instructor, are more problematic than free response. And formal writing assignments that are not reflective or not writing in the discipline appear to have more equity gaps. Low stakes homework also. Less frequent equity gaps in these other things, so free response testing, oral reports, and these types of writing. And here I'm summarizing both from the assessment update paper and the recent data that we shared with you. So that brings us to where we go from here. Am I doing this, Christine, or are you taking over?
You have it.
Okay. Didn't want to overspeak. So it's not enough to identify the classes that have equity gaps. And what I mean there is, you know, everybody's proud of themselves right now if they look at equity gaps either in retention and completion rates of degrees, or they think they're really doing great in the dashboards if they start to show equity gaps within classes. And I've worked with faculty, and I've been a faculty member, and you tell a faculty member that they have a serious equity gap in their class, and it feels hopeless. right? Because what do you do? Like, what, am I racist? Am I, what have I done that causes that equity gap? How do you know that because your final grade has an equity gap? And for me personally, when I started to look within assignments, and I started to feel this even before I started to do this research, but I found that when you take a componential approach and you break it down, what sorts of assignments are showing the equity gaps within a test? What sorts of test questions are the ones that are getting the equity gaps? That's actionable information, right? Because I can find out that when I did my test online, there wasn't an equity gap, and when I did the exact same test in person, there was. That's easy, right? Now I'm empowered, now I'm engaged. And so I really deeply believe that providing faculty with this level of analysis and the ability to ask their students, using our measure of inclusive content and utility value, so to get that fine-grained feedback about assignments, and also to see where the gaps are, is a potentially powerful route to improvement in higher education. There's good research evidence that increasing utility value and inclusive content and alignment reduces equity gaps. There's a reference at the end of this talk to work done by Harakowitz, and I'm probably missaying that name also, out of University of Wisconsin at Madison. Great study. Thousands of intro bio students were randomly assigned to the same essays that either had a utility value clause or not. So the only difference was in the utility value condition, they were asked to relate the concept in biology, explain how it's important to them or their family. In the other condition, they were asked to explain how it's important to the field. And there were reduced equity gaps in that class based on first generational status and ethnicity. And I believe that was the paper where there was reduced equity gaps even in other classes they were taking that semester. And they're doing great work at Madison in general. So for those of you looking for good models in STEM, they've done a lot of really carefully controlled research. So that reference is there. In order to move this work forward, we have to learn more about what students are viewing as these assignments. So I know that no matter how sincerely Christine, Harriet, and I try to think about how students would see these assignments, we don't know. Right? We don't know what's been going on in the lectures. We don't know how welcoming the professor is to questions or feedback. And so I'm really excited to dig into the data where we actually are letting students tell us about the assignments to see whether it supports the value of these constructs. And I think one really important takeaway is that we don't think if you are limited that you can only give multiple choice tests, we don't think that means that you're off the hook in terms of considering these constructs. So where we're going to conclude is talking about how is it that we boost utility value and inclusive content in all assignments.
And I think that's me. And Karen, if you want to reflect on Jill's question, I want to make sure we address that, but I will move quickly because I want to make sure we leave time for questions, and we've addressed many of these topics already. Let me make sure I do not mute myself. All right, so how can we increase utility value? So we've talked about the 3 different types of utility value, academic, professional, and personal, and I'll review those. Personal assignments are those that provide skills for those for future careers for students, and they see the value in that. And the example that we have here is maybe we could, in relationship to a resume, and Karen, are you flipping through those for me there? I think you can still see them in the background. Another one is academically valuable, where students we can foster their skills such that they can use those and take what they have learned and succeed in either the current or future classes that might build upon that knowledge. Third is really personally in relationship to creating a product that the student can use to reflect on him or herself, to use to grow or better understand themselves. And the last bullet point is related to social pedagogy. And I did have to ask Karen what this meant. I think I tend to use a different term, but this is specific to her field, and I like it. And that's where students do their best work when you engage them in an authentic task and engaging them in discussion. And I think Dr. Arbanoff talked about that as well. And so we'll go to the next slide on inclusive content and how we might be able to increase that. is, and we've talked about this, using materials that are accessible to students. Also limiting reliance on material that you haven't taught. Scaffolding is extremely important. And you know what's interesting, I heard this, and I can't remember, I was talking to, or I heard a presentation on this, just-in-time information. I know when I sometimes teach, I teach something, and then we'll use it maybe at a later point in time, or maybe it'll be a few classes later, but sometimes students need to hear it right then and there when they need to use it instead of too far in advance. Recording videos, I think Karen has talked about as well. Using rubrics and really clarifying the rubrics and what you're using and what you're going to be focusing on, and make sure, and communicating that to students. I think someone else brought that up earlier when we first started discussing rubrics. Including clear and explicit instructions, and creating an inclusive environment, which could be, I know I did this when I was teaching math, blind grading. So you flip the page and you'd grade the same question, but you wouldn't know who answered that particular question. And also including diverse faculty and teaching support staff in your environment of instruction. Next is, I can't remember who asked this question, but I said, oh, we'll get to that in the end. What about tests? So we completely understand that, you know, especially if you have a large classroom full of 100 or more students, that multiple choice tests are sometimes, you know, the most efficient, but really examining those questions. So in relationship to that third bullet point is what we're trying to work on, we're thinking about. We call it a test blueprint, which really is identifying what your objectives and goals are and mapping those questions back to them. Sometimes what we find is that, oh, at least, and you know what's interesting is I did this, so it's terrible to be, I think, a teacher of my sons, because I did do this kind of test blueprint and was prepared to talk to the science faculty member and what I found. So I did experiment with this, so it was quite interesting what I found, in that where I thought were, oh, this material wasn't covered, or this was covered more in detail than some other topics that I thought would have been based on the lecture. So also providing feedback, have students provide feedback on the questions. I think Karen did chat about that early on, and how we had students survey about that. Encouraging questions during the test. I know this, sometimes I have done this, it's like, don't ask me any questions, but sometimes people need clarity on what you're asking. Those questions aren't clear, and not only just giving it to the person who asked that question, but sharing that with the whole class as well is important. Conducting an item analysis, I believe Dr. Arbanoff talked about that as well. Actually, I gave a lot in math class, a lot of multiple choice questions, but I did do an analysis to figure out how students performed on each of those questions. Like, is that a good question? Is that not a good question to ask in the future? Limiting test anxiety. I know this really came up with some of our STEM faculty when we moved to online, and their concern was, well, how do I, you know, stop folks from, you know, collaborating on the exam? And we're like, well, but maybe you should, you know, that happens in the real world when you're trying to solve a problem. So maybe have an open book or untimed questions, or providing those in advance to students. And really increasing that utility value in explaining why an exam is the way it is, why you have to memorize, or there needs to be a fast response, and the skills that are necessary that you learn in taking a multiple choice exam and moving to future classes or in future careers. And I think, Carrie, you have the last slide. The next to last slide.
Thank you. Karen, are you addressing any questions at the moment, or do you want me to move on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Time?
Whichever you prefer. I still have a question that came before Christine started, but I can wait and respond.
Let's address that question.
Okay, so Jill Kern asked, is your underlying assumption that if different groups perform differently on an assignment, that the assignment itself is problematic? In other words, might there be real differences in skill achievement? And I think this is a critical question, and the answer is there might, and it's essential for us to know that. So I think that to actually achieve equity in higher ed, and this is a lot of the items that Christine went through, relate to how is it that we address any skill gaps that there might be. And I'm going to just go back to a few of the things that I think are critical for this. Wait a second, where was it? So this just-in-time information, you know, the truth is our nation's high schools are not equal, right? And so students are entering our college campuses underprepared by no fault of their own, right? They can have gotten 100% on every assignment they've ever gotten in some schools and have dramatically less exposure to the types of skills we expect them to have in higher education than the kids sitting next to them. And so we have to accept as a starting place that it's our responsibility to provide access to education by providing ways for students to get experiences they may not have had previously. And so I think a key way to do this is the just-in-time information, where you can say, for this assignment, these are the things you need to do. You can even have a pre-quiz for an assignment, like, you know, if it's a math class, do you remember this skill? If you don't, here's a video. And, you know, this is how kids are used to working today, because everybody lives on their phones, right? Click this link and it's going to help you learn how to do this. When you have those video tutorials, have a student who's representative, or have a range of students that represent the diversity on your campus do those videos. So that, you know, I can't help that I come from a privileged group, right? I'm a continuing generation white woman with good financial resources. And no matter what I do, when I stand at the front of the class, I'm representing that. But when I ask students to prepare just-in-time videos, I can have students that don't represent that privilege. And by giving a range of students that opportunity, you're increasing, you know, this thing back down here, the diverse faculty and teaching support staff. You're making the environment more inclusive, and giving students the experience of being the expert and explaining something strengthens their own mastery of it. So too often when faculty tap students to be teaching assistants or to do demonstration videos, they tap the students that they identify with. And so they just naturally tap the students who look like them and come from similar groups. But I think we need to be really thoughtful about that. And so we provide that information and we dig down to figure out, are those gaps ability gaps or are they measurement gaps? Whenever they're measurement gaps, we better get rid of them, because, and, you know, do all those things that we can to get rid of them, because that's our responsibility. But when we find gaps in abilities, then we need to find routes to helping students get the abilities that are required to succeed in our majors. Did I answer that question? I'm just seeing, we've recently discussed, what about students in a test center for accommodations? They aren't given the opportunity to ask questions. Yeah, that's a great issue. And, you know, this is, again, what happens is the privileged kids come down with the questions, right? So often a faculty member either doesn't allow questions, and that's making an uneven playing field, or if they allow questions, they just answer the person who asked the questions, which is, you know, exaggerating unequal playing fields. What I've done when I have somebody taking the test in a test center, especially now where there's computer podiums at the beginning of the class, is I'll email the person administering the test any additional information, and I'll say to the student, or to the person administering the test in the testing center, please feed this information to the student. And it's still imperfect, but it is a way to accomplish that. Yeah, so then Kimberly brings up, can we design multiple choice tests that aren't just testing memorization? They need help doing this. Yes. Disentangling skill gaps from assessment gaps is important. Yes, and faculty don't realize it's an equity issue. Yes, I think we're ready to move on to conclusions.
All righty.
This is it? Yes.
Makes sense, yes. So in terms of the next steps in this work, disaggregation of responses determining to different forms of assessment reveals the importance of aligning assignments with teaching and student learning outcomes, and how this attends to the context that's being taught in the course. And I mentioned earlier faculty allyship or partnerships, those that want to collaborate and understand that there's equity gaps. I think Karen just mentioned, or someone posted that faculty don't realize it's an equity issue. So one of the things that I think can be done is, as you interact with faculty and maybe have a day-to-day or just meet with one-on-one with them. Christine talked about our scholarship of assessment grants, where we loop in a theme in terms of equity. So we provide them with guidance and criteria around what that scholarship of assessment should look like in terms of equity. And then also the next steps is to scale this project to other courses as well as other programs. And last is to determine if equity gaps reflect assessments or competence, which someone just mentioned in the chat. Next slide, or are there any questions in terms of next steps? So in terms of discussion, if equity gaps exist in your campus after hearing this talk, are there new ways you might begin to investigate these gaps? That's one question to think about. And who would you include in the conversation? Would you include teaching and learning? Would you include faculty members that you may partner with on a grant? So those are some things that you can think about who will be included in this process. Institutional research, and what other approaches you could take to determine whether gaps reflect assignments or competence. And last, what would next steps include to address gaps that result from each? Next slide. Any questions? Okay, so as I wait for more questions to come in the chat, we would like to just give a shout out to our grad assistant, Anna. She's a PhD counseling student at UNC Charlotte, and UNC Charlotte students and faculty, as well as academic affairs. Our office, the Office of Assessment and Accreditation, report under, report up to academic affairs. So these are some special thanks that we want to recognize today in their efforts to help us move forward with this workshop, as well as publications that we now have in the pipeline. And here are a list of references Karen mentioned before that support utility value, that supports equity and assessment.
And at the very beginning of the session, before everybody was on, somebody asked me about references regarding self-reflective writing. And so if you're interested in those, when I send around the slides, I can send around a few other things that I've done that focus more on self-reflective writing and what kinds of assignments there are and stuff like that.
Thank you, Julie, for your comment.
Yes. Thank you. I was typing thank you.
My biggest concern was whether I would get to eat and go to the bathroom, but I managed to mostly succeed on both, although there's still a tiny bit of lunch waiting for me.
You're gonna close this out, or you're gonna wait a few more minutes for some more questions?
Yeah, definitely, if anybody has any other questions.
And let's not forget to thank our moderator, Claudia. I don't know if she's still on with us, but thank you.
I'm on. Thank you. It was a pleasure working with you. I hope I fulfilled my duties appropriately.
Very much so. Do you know if there's going to be an evaluation sent out for the session?
I believe there is an evaluation, and those who are still on will remind them to complete the evaluation. That was one of my duties. I forgot. So do all please complete the evaluation. I'm not quite sure where it's located, and I haven't seen it sent to me for any of the things that I've attended so far, but I know that there is one somewhere.
I think I might just send around a link to our own little evaluation, which is like 3 questions. just to make sure we get the feedback, because, you know, we practice what we preach. We want to improve every time we do this.
Yep, indeed. Yes, the recording of the session will be available. It is being recorded. It takes about 24 hours or so, usually, for these things to get compiled. And AALHE is going to be posting them. I think they're going to put them on the website. There's also going to be proceedings that they'll put them in for a period of time, and you can get those recordings then.
Karen, it was an interesting comment, which I've always agreed with this. Those who were not on the screen had an easier time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's better to lose your video if you can. Yeah.
I thought it was the opposite. Those of us not on the screen had an easier time. It shows you read what you expect to see.
But it
was easier for me when I could see your smiling faces. So thank you to those of you that stayed on the screen. Because, you know, having taught for years, I feel like I figure out what I need to explain better when I see somebody raise an eyebrow or, you know, look off into space. Very hard to talk into a void.
Yeah. Yeah, I did an on-demand recording, and that was just a nightmare. I should have asked two friends to log on so I would have somebody to talk to, because I was just looking out my window at my bird bath. And
yeah,
it's not the same.
So true. Well, I think if there aren't any other questions or discussion, I'll close us out. And I really do, I think we all thank you all for being, you know, incredibly participatory and great group to work with. So thank you.
You want to stop the recording now?
Yes, I'm just saving the chat first, if I can remember how to do that.
Yeah, look.
Karen, I have it.
You have it? So I'm not gonna, okay, so now I'm gonna stop my recording. I have to talk myself through this. It's self-instruction.
Well, thank you all.